impacting over 42 million users and tied to a $3.2 billion market shift. Musk tries to discredit her with sarcasm and outdated tweets, but just 19 minutes in, Crockett flips the entire hearing with leaked internal emails and a voice recording no one can deny. If the richest man in the world built his power by silencing the truth, what happens when the truth finally silences him? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside Capitol Hill's most restricted chamber, the air felt weaponized. This wasn't just another hearing, it was a battlefield wrapped in silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a warning siren. No reporters, no cameras, no live stream. Just power, pressed tight between four marble walls. The hearing had been classified as level red, the highest level of congressional secrecy, meant only for the gravest threats to democratic infrastructure. And yet, Elon Musk sat with one leg casually draped over the other, as if he were hosting a podcast, not answering for allegations of digital authoritarianism. On the opposite side, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, flanked by two silent aides, remained still, chin lifted, lips set like steel. She wasn't just present, she was primed. Every second before her first question felt like the fuse of a grenade, counting down in slow surgical tension. Behind Crockett, 12 members of the House Oversight Committee lined the bench, their eyes flicking between Elon and stacks of sealed files marked confidential X-algorithm leak. The accusations weren't vague. Musk was being held to answer for shadow censorship, algorithmic bias, and platform manipulation during 2 election cycles. But even now, with sworn testimony minutes away, Musk looked bored. He let out a sigh, glancing at his phone until a marshal ordered it off. The arrogance wasn't subtle, it was the point. Jasmine knew the game. This wasn't just about evidence, it was about power, and she was expected to fold. She remembered the backroom whispers before entering, how lobbyists had swarmed committee members, how private messages warned her to go easy or risk losing future cooperation from Silicon Valley. One senior senator even pulled her aside and said, "Don't pick a war with the world's richest man unless you're ready to bleed." But that's exactly what she came to do. Because Musk hadn't just censored random hashtags, his algorithm had quietly strangled black political movements, silenced whistleblowers, and erased the digital footprints of real-world suffering. All under the guise of content moderation. Jasmine wasn't there to ask. She was there to indict. He smirked, slow, deliberate, as if the silence following Crockett's question confirmed what he already believed, that this room, this hearing, this woman in front of him posed no threat. Only irritation. He leaned back in his seat with theatrical ease, like a king settling into his throne before issuing a casual decree. "Maybe law school didn't teach her AI," Elon Musk said, just loud enough for the entire chamber to hear, and just soft enough to pretend it was a joke. The line didn't land like humor, it landed like strategy, the kind of jab that isn't meant to provoke laughter, but to plant doubt. Doubt in the minds of his critics, doubt in the legitimacy of her presence, doubt in the authority of any woman who dares question the architect of the algorithm. A few aides behind him, a polished line of suits with devices open and fingers poised, glanced at each other. Their smirks were immediate, manufactured, as if they'd rehearsed the moment, timed the response. They chuckled, short and sharp, the sound of controlled mockery. Not spontaneous, not real, just performative applause for a man who expected adoration every time he opened his mouth. Jasmine Crockett didn't lift her head. Her right hand moved across her legal pad in slow, firm strokes. No tension in her jaw, no visible reaction. She simply wrote, and yet the discipline it took to stay composed, to deny him the satisfaction of even a flinch, was monumental. She knew the game. He wasn't addressing her intellect. He was targeting her existence. This wasn't about policy, it was about pecking order. And he was making damn sure the room knew who he believed sat above whom. But Musk wasn't done. "You see, Congress still thinks content moderation is censorship," he said, now turning slightly to address the rest of the panel, his voice taking on that smug, polished tech evangelist cadence. "In reality, X is the last free marketplace of ideas. If we start letting politicians like Ms. Crockett decide what qualifies as truth, we may as well burn the Constitution. His tone didn't rise. It dripped, slow, venomous, self-satisfied. Then came the blade, delivered with surgical arrogance. She doesn't want fairness. She wants obedience. And just like that, the air shifted. The room had already been tense, but now it split in two. On the right side, subtle smirks, quiet nods, arms folded in implicit approval. On the left, motionless disapproval, fury held behind clenched jaws and narrowed eyes. The silence became weaponized, no longer neutral. It was complicity for some, constraint for others. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was a crucible. She sat still, her pen pausing just long enough to let the insult settle where it needed to settle. Not in her, but in the record. She'd heard versions of this before. At law school, in the Texas courts, on national television. Different men, same condescension. They questioned not just her ideas, but her legitimacy, her very right to challenge them, as if being a black woman in power was, in itself, a provocation. Musk's words weren't just dismissive, they were calculated, coded in a language of elitism and thinly veiled racism. He had reduced her years of legal experience, her elected office, her lived understanding of systemic bias into a punchline about artificial intelligence. But Crockett didn't respond. Not yet. She knew the weight of stereotypes better than anyone in that chamber. She knew that if she met insult with immediate fury, the headlines would be about her anger, not his arrogance. That the story wouldn't be about algorithms that bury black voices or platforms that amplify hate. It would be about how unprofessional she had been. And that was the real injustice. Being expected to carry grace in the face of degradation. To stay composed when a man with unimaginable influence makes a mockery of your voice on the record. But what Musk didn't understand, what he never could, is that silence is not defeat. Sometimes it's the tightening of a bowstring. And Crockett's arrow was coming. And then, without raising her voice, without shifting in her seat, Jasmine struck. Does your algorithm filter content based on race, Mr. Musk? The question landed like a stun grenade. Not shouted, not embellished, just cold, clean, and impossible to ignore. Her tone was devoid of emotion, and that made it hit harder, like a prosecutor dropping the first charge in a case everyone else had tiptoed around. The oxygen in the room seemed to tighten. Committee members sat back slightly, as if they weren't sure whether to lean into the question or brace for what might follow. Musk hesitated, not overtly, but enough. A fractional pause, a flicker in his eyes, a momentary stillness in the fingers that had been tapping restlessly against the table. For a man who prided himself on immediate answers, the delay said everything. He glanced at his lawyer. No words were exchanged, but the tension between them was like a current. Then Musk turned his head slightly toward the chairman before locking eyes again with Jasmine. His expression settled into something practiced, neutral on the surface, but heavy with condescension underneath. Well, he began, stretching the syllable like it bought him time, race isn't a direct parameter in the input layer of our moderation neural network. We rely on behavioral heuristics, sentiment tagging, and trust indicators, none of which are racially defined. The system learns from user engagement trends and community flagging behavior over time. So technically speaking, it's agnostic. The words were dense, deliberate. They filled the room with the illusion of precision while offering no real answer at all. It wasn't an explanation. It was an evasion written in code, crafted to exhaust rather than inform. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't interrupt. But beneath her stillness was something electric, something you could feel if you looked closely. The way her eyes narrowed just enough to register insult without giving away rage. She had heard this kind of deflection before, not just in tech hearings, in redline mortgage applications, in random traffic stops, in boardrooms where equity was promised but never budgeted. It was always the same script, just with fancier words. We don't discriminate, we just measure behavior. But behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by perception, and perception, when trained on biased data, is discrimination wearing a mask. What Musk called agnostic, she recognized as weaponized neutrality. The kind that flags an activist post as extreme, while letting hate speech slide because it drives engagement, the kind that silences black grief but amplifies white grievance. The kind that hides behind algorithms the same way institutions have always hidden behind policy to avoid responsibility. And still Jasmine said nothing, because in that silence, she was making him sit with the absurdity of his own defense, making everyone in that chamber realize that sometimes the loudest sound in the room is the lie you let echo. She let his evasive answer hang in the air just long enough to collapse under its own emptiness, then calmly, methodically, turned the knife. Without so much as a shift in tone, Jasmine reached into her case and withdrew a folded document, 2 pages thick, printed on cream paper, the kind that carries weight even before it's read. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, giving the room time to see the X-Corp letterhead, the timestamp, the thread of internal names, familiar names. The highlighter marks glared like wounds. And then, her voice as even as a scalpel, she read aloud. "This is an internal email from one of your senior content policy managers," she said. It reads, and I quote, "Content related to black voices should be downranked in visibility due to political sensitivity." Then she placed the email face up in front of her mic. No flourish, no dramatic pause. Just quiet force. The silence that followed was total. Not the silence of confusion or awkwardness, but the kind that happens when everyone in the room realizes they are no longer sitting in a hearing. They're sitting in a reckoning. For a few seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Aide after aide beside Musk tensed like startled prey. One leaned toward a legal pad, scribbling in a panic. Another lifted a hand to their earpiece and murmured urgently. A junior attorney to Musk's left clenched her jaw and turned visibly pale. Whatever internal playbook they had walked in with no longer applied. But the camera, if one had been allowed in that room, would have stayed on Musk. His posture stiffened. Not much, but enough. The smirk was gone. Replaced not by fear, not yet, but something colder. Calculation. You could see it. The gears behind his eyes turning too fast. He was searching for a loophole in real time. But even he knew this wasn't just a PR problem. This wasn't a headline. This was a documented directive. It said that black voices weren't algorithmically overlooked. They were intentionally buried. Jasmine didn't lean back. She didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in truth this ugly. Instead, she tapped the paper gently with her pen. Once. A sound so soft it barely registered. But in that silence, it echoed like thunder. Because that tap meant, look at it, don't look away. This is real. And everyone in that room knew it. What she had laid on the table wasn't just a policy. It was proof that freedom of speech had been weaponized, used to elevate the voices of the powerful, while systematically lowering the volume on anyone deemed too political, too black, or simply too inconvenient. This wasn't about platforms anymore. It was about principle. And Elon Musk had just been caught standing on the wrong side of both. The tap of Jasmine's pen on that printed email had barely faded when she shifted forward in her chair. Posture still composed, but energy shifting, tightening, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The silence around her hadn't just thickened, it had turned volatile. Everyone in the room could sense it. Something bigger was coming. She didn't reach for permission. She didn't build suspense. She simply moved. "I'd like to move to the audio portion of the evidence," she said, her voice low, unwavering, stripped of any theatricality. "I have a sound recording." Gasps didn't break out. This room was too seasoned, too political, too practiced for that. But the shift was undeniable. Spines straightened. Pens stopped moving. One of Musk's attorneys leaned forward like a man anticipating a car crash. Jasmine, unaffected, reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small black USB drive. Unlabeled, ordinary, the kind of thing that disappears in drawers and pockets. But today it held the weight of a courtroom verdict. She didn't raise it like a trophy. She simply held it steady at eye level. "This recording," she continued, "was provided anonymously by a former engineer at X, who resigned under pressure after raising internal objections to content suppression policies." Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was restrained, purposeful. She wasn't here to perform. she was here to reveal. Every person in that room understood what she was doing and what it cost. To present whistleblower evidence in a sealed federal chamber without protection from party politics or media spin was to place your entire career, your safety even, on the line. But Crockett didn't blink. She plugged the USB into the audio terminal before her with a precision that felt ceremonial. Then for just a second, she glanced across the table. Not at the chairman, not at the staffers, but directly at Elon Musk. Their eyes locked. His jaw tightened. A flicker of something, uncertainty, resentment, crossed his face. Jasmine didn't blink. And then she pressed play. A half second of static, then clarity. Elon Musk's voice came through the speakers, unmistakably his, clear, firm, irritated. Keep the George Floyd hashtags buried. Wait for engagement to dip before pulling them entirely. No noise, no coughs, no cross-chatter. It was the voice of a decision made behind a closed door, spoken with the casual cruelty of someone discussing a marketing metric, not a human life. There was no context needed, no editing to distort intent. Just a simple, flat directive, cold enough to chill the blood of anyone listening. And in that moment, the air in the room collapsed into itself. It wasn't silence anymore. It was something heavier, a moral gravity that pulled at every person present. Not a single soul looked away. Because now they couldn't. Because now the lie had a voice, and it belonged to Elon Musk. The final word from the recording had barely dissolved into silence when Elon Musk began to shift. Not dramatically, not in protest, just enough to reveal the crack beneath the armor. His shoulders rolled slightly. One hand tugged at his shirt cuff, the other flexed against the armrest like he was trying to release something invisible pressing down on him. But it was too late. The room had heard his voice, and no matter how many advisors or lawyers sat behind him, nothing could unsay what he'd ordered. That's when the panic surfaced, not from him directly, but from his team. A young legal advisor seated just behind Musk surged forward in his seat, his face flushed and his voice trembling as he tried to override the room's momentum. Madam Chair, this recording is inadmissible. This is a violation of procedural. He never finished the sentence. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't shift in her chair. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she lowered it, each word sharp, deliberate, and unshakably calm, like a judge issuing a verdict. You're interrupting a sitting member of Congress during a federal hearing? Then her voice dropped even deeper, resonating like a gavel across marble. We are listening to evidence of a crime. The impact was immediate. The young lawyer froze mid-sentence, his mouth still slightly open. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward him, not in anger, but in disbelief, like someone had just yelled during a funeral. Slowly, visibly rattled, he sank back into his seat without another word. Even the chairman, whose earlier caution had suggested a desire to keep this hearing tidy and politically palatable, remained silent. He knew, as did everyone else now, that the threshold had been crossed. This wasn't political theater anymore. This was accountability, and Jasmine Crockett had seized it with terrifying precision. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't grandstand. She simply turned her gaze back to Elon Musk, calm as stone, her voice now a quiet force holding the entire room hostage. Because she knew what men like him counted on: chaos, deflection, legal fog. But there was no fog left. The smoke had cleared, and underneath it stood the truth, uncomfortable, unpolished, undeniable. The air was still recovering from the weight of Jasmine's last words. No one spoke. No one dared. For a moment, the hearing chamber felt less like a place of debate and more like a place where something irreversible had just been exposed. Something that could not be walked back, not explained away with PR language or legalese. And that was when Elon Musk broke. It wasn't loud at first, just the subtle shift of his body, like someone trying to shake off a weight he could no longer carry. His knuckles whitened against the table's edge. His jaw flexed. And then, in a flash of motion too fast to be rehearsed, he pushed back his chair and stood. Violently, the sharp screech of metal legs scraping across marble sliced through the room like a warning shot. His composure, the armor he had worn for nearly the entire hearing, shattered in real time. And what was left behind wasn't brilliance or control. It was fury, unvarnished, unguarded. "This isn't a hearing," he snapped, voice rising in pitch and volume, like a dam finally cracking. "It's a witch hunt orchestrated by the left." The words slammed into the room. It wasn't just the volume, it was the tone. This wasn't strategy, it was instinct. The kind of response you give when you've run out of cards but still want to flip the table. And in that single outburst, he exposed exactly what Jasmine had known all along. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to being obeyed. Now every eye in the room was locked on him, not out of respect, but out of concern. Because what stood before them wasn't the composed CEO of a trillion-dollar empire. It was a man unraveling under the heat of his own record. Musk leaned forward with a burst of urgency and flipped open his personal laptop, its screen casting a cold blue glow across the table. His fingers moved fast, erratic. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the rapid clacking of keys. The display flickered, then stabilized. And suddenly, there it was, a collage of digital fragments, arranged like a political smearboard. He turned the laptop toward the committee. On screen were social media posts from nearly a decade ago, grainy screenshots of Jasmine Crockett's personal Twitter account, a blog post headline from her grassroots activism days, even a freeze frame from a long-forgotten interview where she had spoken about corporate data surveillance. Words circled in red: billionaire recklessness, tech platforms addicted to control, Silicon Valley's untouchables. "This," Musk declared, stabbing his finger toward the screen like a prosecutor presenting Exhibit A, "is proof that Congresswoman Crockett has hated me long before today. This isn't oversight. This is personal." The room didn't gasp. It froze. A tremor of uncertainty rippled through the committee. Not because they believed him, but because they recognized the tactic. This was classic power, not answering an accusation, but redirecting the light, from what he'd done to who was daring to expose it. And for Jasmine, this was familiar ground. This wasn't just a billionaire trying to humiliate her. It was a man, backed into a corner, weaponizing her past, her voice, her advocacy, her truth, as a way to delegitimize her present, to make the room forget the evidence, the email, the audio, the directives, to make them instead focus on a woman who had once dared to speak out before she had a title. It wasn't just unfair. It was textbook. And worst of all, it wasn't even for the committee. It was for the cameras that weren't there. It was for the sound bites that would leak, the headlines that would run. Crockett biased from the beginning? He was already writing them, live, in real time. He wasn't defending himself. He was preparing the counterattack. Because for men like Musk, being held accountable is never a crisis. It's just another algorithm to control. And Jasmine Crockett had just disrupted it. The room was still reeling from Musk's deflection, the digital images of old tweets still glowing on his laptop like flickers of smoke from a fire he was desperately trying to ignite. His voice, filled with accusation, had tried to reroute the hearing, away from the crimes in his own record, toward the perceived bias of the woman daring to hold him accountable. But Jasmine Crockett didn't look shaken. She looked still. That stillness wasn't silence. It was control. She knew this moment by heart. She had lived it 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms. When the facts were on her side, but the attack turned personal, when her intellect was disregarded and her passion was spun as prejudice. When men like Musk, powerful, untouchable, attempted to reduce her to a caricature of bitterness, because that was easier than facing what she actually represented, truth in public view. So she stood, slowly, with intention, with the silence of the room pressing into her back like a tidal force. The scrape of her chair on the marble floor sounded almost ceremonial, like the strike of a match just before the blaze. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't falter. She rose with the calm of someone who had waited long enough, who had been dismissed long enough, who now refused to stay seated while history tried to rewrite her. She met Musk's gaze head-on, and when she spoke, her voice did not tremble. It rang. "You're wrong," she said, each word cut clean, deliberate, undeniable. "I don't hate you. I hate abuse. I hate when power is used to silence an entire generation." The room didn't just hear her, it felt her. Every syllable carried not just her truth, but the weight of those who'd been shadow banned, muted, throttled, digitally erased, all in the name of keeping things politically safe or algorithmically neutral. Musk had tried to turn this into a vendetta, but Jasmine had turned it into a mirror. And now all he could see was himself, stripped of myth, exposed for what he had built, a machine that punished dissent and called it free speech. And she wasn't done, not by a long shot. But in that moment, she didn't need to say another word, because the balance of power had shifted, not by force, not by wealth, but by a truth that refused to be filtered. The silence after Jasmine's words wasn't just silence, it was a vacuum. It pulled the oxygen from the room, pressed against every chest, left no space for spin or rebuttal. Even Elon Musk, who had spent the better part of the hearing dominating the tempo, now sat motionless. His mouth was tight, his gaze locked forward, but the confident veneer had cracked. Around him, his lawyers exchanged silent, anxious glances. They could feel it. Something was shifting. Then the sound that broke it, click. A door at the far end of the chamber eased open. Not the main entrance, but the discreet staff corridor typically used only during private proceedings. Heads turned. Committee aides leaned in. The chairman's brow furrowed as a staffer moved quickly to his side and whispered something into his ear. A sealed file folder was passed between them, and after a long, tense beat, the chairman nodded slowly. "The committee has approved an emergency witness," he said, his voice heavy with consequence. "Please welcome Caitlin Rivera." There was no fanfare, no dramatic music, just a woman walking alone into a storm that had been building all morning. Caitlin Rivera, former head of ethics at X. She was dressed plainly, no blazer, no designer heels, no makeup layered for cameras that weren't there. Just a pale blue blouse, dark slacks, and a messenger bag slung across one shoulder. She moved with a quiet resolve, her expression unreadable but focused. She didn't walk like someone seeking attention. She walked like someone who had finally decided enough was enough. Musk stiffened. His eyes followed her across the room with barely disguised tension. His fingers tapped once, twice on the tabletop before curling into his palm. It wasn't panic exactly. It was recognition. He knew who she was. And more importantly, he knew what she knew. Rivera took her seat at the witness table. The oath was administered. Her right hand raised, her voice steady. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." The moment didn't feel procedural. It felt personal. Everyone knew the stakes had just shifted from policy to confession. She folded her hands in front of her and leaned forward slightly into the microphone. No notes, no hesitation. "I was the lead on algorithmic ethics at X until I resigned last year. I was summoned to a closed-door meeting with Mr. Musk and two senior engineers. During that meeting, I was directly instructed to optimize the platform's algorithm to suppress hashtags related to police brutality protests." She didn't glance at Musk yet. She kept her eyes on the committee, on the people she knew would decide whether truth still meant anything in this building. She paused just for breath, not for drama, then continued, voice unwavering. His exact words were, "It's hurting the stock. Bury it until the heat dies down." The room went still, not just quiet but paralyzed. There was no scribbling of notes, no shifting in seats, not even a cough from the back rows. What she had said wasn't shocking because it was unbelievable. It was shocking because it wasn't. They had all suspected, whispered, speculated. But this was different. This was testimony, under oath, with a name, a title, a date, and a directive. And it had come not from a journalist or a leak, but from a woman who had sat inside the heart of the machine. A woman who had been responsible for ethical oversight and now stood before Congress to admit that oversight had been crushed under the weight of profit. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't nod or interject. She simply watched, silent, steady. Her presence alone a counterweight to the power Musk had once thought insurmountable. Across the table, Musk didn't move either, but his stillness had changed. This was no longer calculated calm. This was coiled tension, the kind that comes when someone realizes the room has turned, when the walls start closing and the script starts failing. Rivera remained composed, but you could see the effort it took. Her shoulders were drawn back, but her hands trembled faintly at the knuckles. Not out of fear, but the strain of carrying a truth too long. She had been the person tasked with guiding one of the most powerful platforms on Earth toward ethical standards. And she had been told, clearly, unequivocally, that those standards would always take a backseat to Wall Street. She had obeyed for a time, until she couldn't, until the dissonance between what she knew and what she was being ordered to ignore had finally cracked her silence. And now she had chosen this room, this moment, to break it. Her words had stripped the case bare. No longer was it about speculation or accusation. No longer was it about Crockett's old tweets or political motivations. It was about this: a CEO, one of the most powerful men in the world, giving a direct order to suppress public discourse about state violence. Not because it was false, or hateful, or dangerous, but because it was bad for the brand. It's hurting the stock. Bury it until the heat dies down. That line now lived in the congressional record. And no matter how Musk twisted in his seat, no matter how many PR firms or legal teams scrambled behind the scenes, he could not pull it back. The room remained frozen, and the silence this time wasn't one of uncertainty. It was reverence. Because sometimes truth doesn't land like a bomb, it lands like a bell and keeps ringing. The silence that followed Rivera's testimony was suffocating, not because it left anything unsaid, but because it said too much. The words were still echoing. Bury it until the heat dies down. When something visibly shifted in Elon Musk. His hands, which had gripped the edge of the table all morning like anchors, now began to twitch. His knee bounced once under the table. His breathing quickened, shallow and audible. And then, without warning, the crack became a break. He lurched to his feet like a man who had just realized the walls weren't just closing in. They had already locked. His voice exploded into the chamber, cracking like a whip, sharp with panic and humiliation. That's a lie. She was fired for incompetence. His face had flushed red, but not with rage. It was something else, something messier. Desperation, unfiltered and unstrategic. He slammed a palm against the table, as if that alone could hold together what was rapidly collapsing. His other hand gestured furiously in Rivera's direction, but she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She sat with the stillness of someone who had long ago surrendered her fear. And now her silence only amplified his unraveling. The room didn't react, not because it wasn't shocking, but because it was expected. The powerful always scream when their authority is pierced by a fact they can't delete. Musk scanned the committee, searching for allies, but none of the usual expressions greeted him. The faces staring back weren't those of admirers or supporters. They were masks of stone. Neutral, yes, but underneath you could feel it. A collective shift. The myth was bleeding. And Jasmine Crockett, she hadn't even stood. She sat still for a breath longer than necessary, letting his outburst hang in the air like a cigarette burned down to the filter. Then calmly she turned to her staffer, who passed her a small remote with the kind of precision that only comes when something has been prepared for this exact moment. She rose, not with force, not with anger, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that doesn't need to announce itself, because it is the room now. She looked Musk dead in the eye. Then what about this video? She didn't blink. She didn't look around for approval. She pressed play. The screens mounted around the chamber flickered to life. Every single one synced to the same footage. A Zoom meeting interface filled the displays, time-stamped and tagged with internal X metadata. Multiple squares, multiple executives. And there, unmistakable in the top corner, sat Elon Musk. Black t-shirt, jaw set, tone dismissive. The audio kicked in instantly. I don't care about justice. I care about engagement. The sentence didn't just drop. It detonated. There was no ambiguity in his voice. No sarcasm. No joking context. Just a flat, clean admission delivered to a room of subordinates who had said nothing back. And now in this hearing chamber, everyone heard what they hadn't been meant to hear. The air grew heavier with every passing second, not because people didn't understand, but because they did. What Musk had tried to paint as censorship had now revealed itself as commerce. What he had called freedom of expression was exposed as a metric, and what he had insisted was principle had just been revealed as profit dressed in a moral disguise. He stood motionless, still on his feet, but his presence had shrunk. His jaw twitched. His hands had stopped moving. The fight, so frantic only moments ago, had been replaced by something colder. Recognition. The truth had spoken, and this time, it had his face, his voice, and his name on it. Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't have to. The room had already heard enough. The sentence had dropped, and the air hadn't recovered. I don't care about justice. I care about engagement. That voice, his voice, still echoed in the walls, even as the footage faded into black. Elon Musk remained standing, but it was as if the floor beneath him had vanished. The weight of the lie he had been carrying all day now settled on his shoulders in full view of the committee. And he knew, everyone knew, it was no longer a question of what he had said. It was a question of what would be done about it. Then from the back of the chamber, a new sound emerged. Not another voice in debate, not another outburst. A voice of authority. Cold, official, final. The FBI has opened a federal investigation. A sealed warrant for data seizure is being executed. Every head in the chamber turned toward the rear entrance, where two figures in dark suits had just entered. They moved with quiet urgency, not dramatic, not hostile, but precise, practiced. The silver badge hanging from one agent's lanyard caught the light for only a second before it disappeared beneath his jacket again. The murmurs died instantly. The two agents didn't approach Musk directly. They didn't issue commands. They didn't raise their voices. Instead, one stepped toward the end of the long mahogany hearing table and calmly handed a sealed envelope to Elon's lead counsel, his hand visibly shaking as he accepted it. The bold black letters on the front read, United States District Court, sealed data warrant. The second agent, holding a slim black case, placed it on the ground at Musk's feet. Not a briefcase, not a weapon. A secure digital intake unit, standard procedure for tech-based seizures. It was all happening in silence, with terrifying efficiency. Elon didn't move. His eyes flicked to the case, then the envelope, then to the agents. And for the first time, the man who had spent the last decade treating subpoenas like spam mail was facing the reality that no algorithm could suppress. This was no longer a hearing. It was an inflection point, and Jasmine Crockett understood that more than anyone in the room. She stood slowly, just enough for her voice to rise with clarity, but not with volume. She didn't perform. She spoke, steady, controlled, final. You're not under arrest, she said, every syllable as sharp as a blade being unsheathed. But for the first time, your power is going to be audited. The line didn't need to be loud. It carried the weight of law, morality, and long-suppressed outrage. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, and it pierced deeper than handcuffs ever could. Around her, the committee members, many of whom had stayed neutral all morning, now sat upright, alert, as if gravity itself had shifted in the room. Phones had been silenced. Notebooks had stopped flipping. Even the stenographer paused her typing. No one breathed too loudly. No one dared to interrupt what had become more than a moment. It was history unfolding in real time. Musk finally looked at Crockett, really looked at her, no longer as an opponent, no longer as a nuisance, but as the woman who had done what his army of lawyers, publicists, engineers, and influencers couldn't prepare for, cut through the myth of him. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again. No denial could undo what had been heard. No insult could discredit what had been played. And the envelope now sitting in his lawyer's trembling hand was not political. It was procedural, judicial, federal. Across the room, Caitlin Rivera sat in silence, her gaze steady, her face pale but unmoved. She hadn't flinched when Musk called her incompetent. She hadn't reacted when the video played, but now with the FBI present and the record sealed, she allowed herself a single, controlled breath. She had spoken. Jasmine had delivered, and the system, at least today, had answered. The agents didn't linger. They didn't speak to Musk again. Their work was done for now. The warrant had been served. The hardware had been handed off, and the process, long, grinding, inevitable, had begun. But the hearing chamber didn't exhale. No one felt relief, only stillness, because everyone understood what this really meant. This wasn't about just one man. It wasn't about just one platform. It wasn't even about one hearing. This was a mirror held up to power, and the reflection had finally cracked. Jasmine stood perfectly still at her microphone, her hands folded in front of her, as if anchoring herself through the tremor that had just torn through the room. She had walked into this hearing knowing the odds were stacked, knowing the smear campaign would come, that her past post would be weaponized, that her composure would be tested. But she had done it anyway. And now, in the aftermath of her question, her video, her voice, there were no more headlines to distract from the truth. No more algorithmic shields. No more carefully engineered narratives. Just a man, a room, a warrant, and a voice that finally made them all matter. The chairman cleared his throat once, but said nothing. The agents exited quietly, the door clicking shut behind them with a sound that felt heavier than thunder. The moment had passed, but its weight remained. No one in that chamber, not the staffers, not the aides, not the senior representatives, would forget what had just happened, because power, for the first time in a long time, had been forced to pause. Jasmine finally stepped back from the microphone. She didn't smile. She didn't claim victory. She simply turned off her mic and sat back down, slowly, calmly, and with the posture of someone who had carried far more than evidence today. She had carried memory, history, and justice, and she had delivered it, not with fury, but with truth. And now, the silence in that room said it all. For the first time in Elon Musk's public life, no one was defending him. No one dared, not even him. The agents had left, and the chamber had returned to stillness. But it wasn't peace. It was a silence so thick it felt like pressure on the chest. Papers lay untouched. The video feed screens had gone black. And Elon Musk, once the towering figure in the room, now sat slouched, blinking too fast, his hands twitching on the tabletop as if trying to grab hold of a reality slipping through his fingers. He hadn't said a word since the FBI agents walked out. But now something broke. He shifted forward suddenly, pushing his chair back with a scrape and waving his hand in the air, like he was swatting away smoke. "Can we take a break?" he said, his voice cracking at the edges. 5 minutes. I need a recess." No one answered. He stood, tried again, more forcefully this time. "We need to stop this, just for a moment. I want a recess. 10 minutes. 15. His tone was rising, not in authority, but in desperation. It wasn't a request. It was the pleading of a man cornered by his own reflection. His legal team remained frozen, uncertain whether to support or distance. Behind him, one aide silently closed the laptop still glowing with Crockett's damning screenshots. Musk's face was pale now, the flush of arrogance long gone. He looked toward the chairman, then to the committee, then to no one in particular. "I need a break," he muttered again, this time barely above a whisper. A centrist congressman near the end of the panel, older and known for rarely taking sides, leaned toward the mic and offered a gentle escape hatch. "Mr. Chairman, perhaps we allow a 10-minute recess to collect." But before he could finish, Jasmine Crockett stood. No theatrics, no raised voice, just unwavering focus and the kind of moral clarity that doesn't ask permission. "I don't break," she said firmly, eyes never leaving Musk. "Not when the truth is burning." Her voice carried not just conviction, but weariness, the kind of tired that only comes from carrying stories the world keeps trying to erase. She wasn't grandstanding. She was refusing to look away. And with those 8 words, the entire room remembered why they were here. Musk didn't sit. He remained standing, lost somewhere between command and collapse, his mouth half open as if caught mid-thought, mid-regret, mid-realization that something was happening he could no longer control. And Jasmine, who had waited patiently all day for this exact moment, turned the page. "I'm submitting a supplemental exhibit," she said, motioning to the aide beside her. "Internal analytics from X's Trust and Safety Division. These were obtained by a whistleblower after the 2022 algorithm restructuring." The screen behind her lit up again. Bar graphs, heat maps, Hashtag suppression lists. But it wasn't just data, it was a confession in numbers. In the 12 months following the restructuring, she continued, posts containing terms associated with Black activism, such as Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Stop Cop City, saw a 74% reduction in visibility. Not because of hate speech violations, not because of flag content, but because of internal classification as high risk for brand safety. She turned a page. Posts referencing immigration rights, particularly those using Spanish-language phrases like Unidos Somos Más or Abolish ICE, were deprioritized at a 62% rate under the same classification. She paused. Let it sink in. This wasn't algorithmic neutrality, she said. It was algorithmic erasure. Gasps didn't fill the room, but jaws clenched. The committee, many of whom had once played polite with tech executives, now sat with shoulders drawn tight, their hands frozen halfway through note-taking. This wasn't abstract anymore. These were not mistakes of scale. These were patterns of choice. Musk looked up slowly. Something in him had shifted. The veneer had shattered already, but now even the fragments were falling away. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just sat down, hard, like the weight of what had been exposed was finally too heavy to carry with posture. Then he did something no one in that room had seen him do all day. He dropped his face into both hands, not like a man hiding from light, like a man realizing it was never going to turn off again. The billionaire who had walked in with a smirk and a soundbite was now hunched forward like someone absorbing a sentence. Not a legal one, not yet, but a moral one. His empire had built the platform, but Jasmine Crockett had stripped away the curtain, and all that was left was a man in retreat. The room didn't move. No one whispered. No one shuffled. Not even the stenographer resumed typing. Because something sacred had happened, something rare, a moment where power, for all its wealth and insulation, had been forced to feel what it had always deflected. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She stood alone, in full view of a system that had doubted her, demeaned her, tried to distract her, and now finally was forced to listen. Because when truth burns that bright, the room doesn't get to look away. Not anymore. The air in the chamber had shifted from pressure to paralysis. Elon Musk sat, unmoving, his hands pressed together in a half prayer, half shield just beneath his chin. He looked neither at the committee nor at his counsel. His gaze was fixed downward, unblinking, as if what had just happened, the video, the FBI, the numbers, had sucked the color out of the room, and now he was watching the ground split open beneath his feet. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She stood with the gravity of someone not delivering a blow, but lowering the final stone on a sealed tomb. She stepped up to the microphone one last time. The movement alone turned heads, subtle but absolute. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each step as deliberate as a verdict approaching its reading. Her hands, steady all morning, now clasped the edge of the wooden table, not for balance but to command stillness. She didn't scan the room. She didn't even look at Elon. She just spoke. You use technology to control the truth, but I use the truth to control you. The line didn't explode. It reverberated. Slow, cold, clean, like a razor drawn across years of unchecked power. Like the final sentence in a court transcript that would one day be studied in constitutional law classes. And the moment it left her lips, the energy in the room changed, not toward rage, not toward applause, but toward respect. The kind of respect that doesn't make noise. It stands. A low, instinctive rustle swept through the room. One by one, people rose from their chairs. No one spoke. No one moved quickly. There was no choreography. It was simply appropriate. Even members of the committee who had not spoken a word all day, who had danced around neutrality like it was their party line, now stood, not to side with a politician, but to acknowledge what had just taken place. Jasmine didn't bow, didn't thank them. She stayed still, hands braced on the table, as if grounding herself not in pride, but in gravity. Then she reached forward and picked up the slim legal folder she had kept closed since the beginning of the hearing. One simple manila envelope, creased at the edges, labeled in black marker. She opened it, withdrew a single signed document, and held it up. Not high, not for theater. Just high enough that no one could pretend they didn't see it. "I am formally recommending," she said, "that all materials, testimonies, and digital evidence submitted in this hearing be transferred immediately to the Department of Justice for independent investigation and potential criminal referral." Her tone was flat, devoid of any celebratory note. This wasn't triumph. This was duty, and it hit harder than any accusation that had come before it. Musk didn't move. The words landed on him like bricks, each one heavier than the last. He didn't turn to his attorneys. He didn't glance at the cameras that weren't even allowed in the room. He didn't try to interrupt, not this time. He simply sat, staring forward with the dull, unfocused eyes of someone who had just discovered the floor was gone beneath him and the free fall had already begun. A motion passed from Jasmine's hand to a staffer, then across the panel, where the chair received it with visible tension in his fingertips. He didn't speak either, he simply nodded. One short, final movement, enough to make it official. Somewhere in the back, a staff member exhaled too loudly and immediately caught themselves, because no one in the room dared break the moment. Jasmine stepped away from the microphone. That alone was enough to finish the hearing, but the room still wasn't breathing, and Elon Musk, once the orchestrator of attention, the king of headlines, the avatar of algorithmic influence, remained seated, unmoving, like a machine that had finally overheated and shut down. His fingers twitched faintly over the table surface. He wasn't restrained, he wasn't under arrest, but he was trapped, not by the FBI, by reality. He tried once to lift his eyes. They landed on no one, and that was when one of his aides rushed forward, clearly uncertain, clearly improvising. The man moved like someone who wanted to be useful, but knew it was too late. In his hand, a cold bottle of water, beads of condensation already running down the sides. He placed it gently on the table beside Elon, leaned in, whispered something. Something no one could hear. Elon didn't react. He didn't nod. He didn't touch the bottle. The label glared under the overhead lights, untouched, like everything else he once controlled, now inert. Because what was left to swallow? What spin? What explanation? What PR memo could be sipped now that every truth had been said out loud, recorded, witnessed, filed? There was nothing left to absorb, nothing left to deflect. And that was the cost. Not handcuffs, not yet. But something heavier, isolation. The kind that doesn't come from being removed, but from realizing that every version of yourself, the billionaire, the innovator, the disruptor, has been outlived by a single sentence you could never take back. "I don't care about justice. I care about engagement." And that voice, the voice that once commanded stock markets, had now rendered him small, not because it was loud, but because it had been true. Crockett sat back down slowly, her spine straight, her gaze still fixed ahead. She didn't whisper, didn't gloat. She simply pressed her hands together, placed them on the table, and breathed. It was over. But more than that, it had happened, and now the world beyond those doors would never see him the same way again. Because the truth, once spoken in rooms like this, does not ask permission to leave. It walks out on its own, and it takes the myth with it. Outside the Capitol, the storm had already begun. By the time the hearing room door clicked shut behind the last staffer, the headlines had detonated. There was no press conference, no public statement, just one name, one phrase, and one leak that spread like fire in a drought. Elon Musk under federal criminal investigation. Within minutes, the words blanketed every major outlet. CNN broke it first with a banner graphic and a one-line update. MSNBC followed, then Reuters, then the BBC. Across oceans in different languages, the same headline twisted itself through 1,000 digital veins, reaching every phone, every screen, every boardroom that had once treated his tweets as scripture. Hashtag after hashtag erupted, but one soared above the rest. Jasmine vs. Elon. It started as a whisper, a single thread posted by a civil rights attorney from Detroit, who screen recorded Jasmine's closing line and uploaded it raw. No edit, no filter, just 7 seconds of Crockett staring directly into the soul of power and saying, "You use technology to control the truth, but I use the truth to control you." The post exploded, retweeted by activists, celebrities, tech critics, and journalists. By the time the East Coast reached mid-afternoon, it was the #1 trend on the planet. Not a meme, not a scandal, a moment, a reckoning dressed as a quote. The kind of sentence that no one could scroll past because it didn't just apply to Musk, it applied to everything. Cable news hosts tried to scramble live panels. Commentators were caught off guard, forced to confront not just what had happened, but how it happened. This wasn't a staged takedown. It wasn't a partisan trap. It was something purer and more dangerous to the status quo. A woman, in a room full of silence, who refused to be edited out. Reddit blew up. Subforums that typically worship Musk fractured in real time. Some tried to defend him. Others posted the video, the email, the whistleblower statement, the Zoom quote, and simply captioned it, "This isn't innovation. This is manipulation." And then in the middle of the viral chaos came the quote that no one expected, posted by a third-year law student from Howard University, posted without fame, without filters, without intention of going viral, just truth. Crockett didn't just question Musk. She questioned an entire century where power always beat reason. Within 15 minutes, it was on every major Instagram story of every progressive publication. Within an hour, it was printed on signs in front of Twitter's San Francisco office. By dusk, it had been turned into a mural, spray painted on the side of a bookstore in Oakland, in bold, slanted type beneath a black and white still of Jasmine Crockett at the microphone. Meanwhile, inside the Capitol, the hearing room had gone still. The chairs were empty. The documents had been collected. The lights were dimmed, but not fully turned off. The echo of the day still lingered in the corners, where the aides had whispered, where Musk had broken, where the truth had first entered and refused to leave. Jasmine stood alone now. She hadn't left immediately like the others. She didn't rush into a media scrum. She didn't take the elevator down into the roar of flashbulbs and shouted questions. She stayed behind. Her hands rested on the table's edge. She looked around, not at the power, not at the nameplates, not at the microphones, but at the silence. And then, very quietly, to no one but herself, she spoke. "There will be more hearings." A pause, a breath. But today, the truth had the mic. Her voice didn't need an audience. It wasn't for the internet. It wasn't for the cameras. It was for the ghosts that usually sit in rooms like this. Uninvited, unheard. The ghosts of women silenced, of whistleblowers buried, of truth drowned beneath titles, bank accounts, and procedural shrugs. The ghosts of "you're overreacting," of "you'll lose your future if you say that," of "he's too big to challenge." And in that quiet chamber, for the first time in decades, those ghosts had been given voice, not to haunt, to witness. Jasmine slowly packed her notes, her pen, her folder. Her hands didn't shake, her eyes didn't glisten. She had trained herself long ago to be calm in the aftermath, not because she didn't feel, but because she had learned the world doesn't allow women like her to show the impact of carrying history. She stepped out into the hallway. Behind her, the hearing room lights dimmed to black. Before her, a line of staffers waiting silently. And down the hall, the storm. The world had already changed. It didn't know it yet, but it had. Not because Elon Musk had fallen, but because Jasmine Crockett had stood. But even as the echo of her words faded into the marble bones of the Capitol, something deeper was unfolding. Quieter than headlines, slower than hashtags, but infinitely more lasting. The lesson. Because moments like this, moments when power stumbles and truth doesn't, don't just change laws or reputations. They change people, one by one, silently, irreversibly. And for anyone watching, for anyone who had ever felt outnumbered, underestimated, or overwritten, the hearing wasn't just political theater. It was a mirror, a dare, a human turning point. Not because Jasmine Crockett humiliated Elon Musk, but because she didn't let herself be deleted. She had walked into that chamber carrying generations of silence on her back. Every time she was interrupted, every time her past posts were weaponized, every time a billionaire tried to reduce her to a headline, she absorbed it, not with passivity, but with purpose. She didn't scream. She didn't fold. She sharpened. And that alone was the most human act of all, because when the world tells you to shrink and you choose instead to stand taller, it's not ego. It's survival. That's the part most people will miss. This was never just about Musk's misdeeds or algorithmic corruption. It was about the quiet violence of being unheard. It was about what happens when truth has to crawl through locked doors, buried data, secret emails, and billion-dollar barricades just to be taken seriously. It was about how hard it still is in 2025 for a woman of color to walk into a room built to silence her and refuse to stay quiet. And that's the point. Power doesn't fear chaos, it fears clarity. Musk had chaos on his side. Talking points, engineers, lobbyists, media shields. But Jasmine brought clarity. One sentence at a time. One document at a time. One stare that never blinked. And in a world addicted to noise, clarity is lethal. The truth didn't scream that day. It stood still, and it made everyone else listen. But the cost of that stillness? It's rarely shown. It's not in the headlines or the trending tags. It's in the fatigue behind her eyes when the cameras shut off. In the weight of every whispered threat that never makes it into press coverage. In the inboxes flooded with hate masked as opinion. That's what justice looks like when you're on the front line. Not glorious, not clean, but relentless. Because here's the hardest truth of all. You don't win by being louder. You win by being undeniable. And Jasmine Crockett was undeniable not because she outshouted Musk, but because she outlasted every attempt to silence her. When they laughed, she wrote. When they deflected, she listened. When they dismissed her, she documented. She wasn't trying to go viral. She was trying to be exact. There's something almost violent in how subtle that strategy was. No drama, just receipts. And in doing so, she taught us something else. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a roar. It arrives in a woman calmly reading from a folder and watching a billionaire fold. That is what broke the spell. Not her anger, her precision, not her rage, her refusal to be erased. And what's more human than that? We all know what it feels like to be silenced, to be overlooked in rooms where we did the work, but someone else got the mic. To watch people in power tell half-truths while the rest of us bleed in the margins. We know what it's like to carry receipts no one wants to read, to say things that cost us relationships, opportunities, safety. Jasmine Crockett didn't destroy Musk. She showed the world what it takes to speak truth to power when power has a microphone the size of the internet. And in doing so, she taught us the most terrifyingly hopeful thing of all. They're not untouchable. They're just used to not being touched. So what now? Now you act. In whatever space you occupy, you act not out of guilt, but out of clarity. Out of the understanding that justice doesn't trickle from the Supreme Court down. It rises from classrooms, from courtrooms, from conversations where people finally stop editing their truth to keep others comfortable. It rises when you challenge a sentencing policy that's buried under bureaucratic jargon. When you vote in local elections that appoint judges with unchecked power. When you ask why black teenagers are labeled threats, while white ones are called troubled. And when you refuse to accept that silence equals civility. You act by learning the names of the judges on your ballot, not just the celebrities on the bench. You look up their records. You attend school board meetings where disciplinary policies are often early blueprints for courtroom disparities. You listen, especially to the stories that don't end with perfect victims or clear heroes. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a crowded federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett comes face-to-face with Judge Elon, the very judge who silenced her 8 years ago. Judge Cannon, now under investigation for a troubling pattern of unusually harsh sentences against people of color, believed she was still in control, until Jasmine spoke up, exposing buried rulings and racial bias. Will the truth finally pierce the robe, or be buried beneath it once again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C. The federal courthouse wasn't ready, not for the silence, not for the cameras, not for the storm in heels about to take her seat. Outside, crowds pressed against barricades, chanting names of the justice system buried. Judge Aileen Cannon sat composed, her robe perfect, her gaze sharp, but the numbers behind her rulings had summoned this reckoning. She wasn't in control. She was under scrutiny. For years, Cannon's reputation commanded fear. Her courtroom was a place where compassion came second and order reigned absolute. But behind the facade of legal discipline were cracks. Deep, racial, undeniable. Nearly 80% of her harshest sentences landed on Black or Latino men. Appeals, all denied. Motions for reconsideration, rejected. And now across from her, the woman who once stood powerless in her courtroom had returned, this time not as counsel, but as Congress. Jasmine Crockett had come not to plead. She'd come to expose. She entered not as a politician, but as a former civil rights attorney with unfinished business. Her presence turned heads not just because of the tailored Navy suit or the confidence she carried like armor, but because everyone knew why she was here. She had once begged this very judge to spare a young man named Malik Washington, a 22-year-old college student arrested in a police altercation where he ended up bloodied, not the officer. No weapon, no threat, just a voice that didn't lower quickly enough. 14 years. Jasmine had tried everything. Body cam footage, eyewitnesses, a clean record. It hadn't mattered. Judge Cannon's words had echoed then. We cannot set a precedent of leniency in confrontations with law enforcement. Now the tables turned. Jasmine wasn't standing in the gallery. She was seated at the center dais, backed by the weight of Congress, flanked by committee members, and broadcast to a nation starving for justice. Cannon didn't flinch when their eyes met. But Jasmine, she didn't blink either. Her opening statement sliced through the tension like a blade drawn in the dark. Today, we're not just reviewing rulings, she said, her voice low, unwavering. We're reviewing who gets to rule. And with that, the room stilled, because everyone knew this wasn't going to be a hearing. It was going to be a reckoning. But as Jasmine locked eyes with the woman who once crushed her in silence, the air shifted, not just with tension, but with unfinished war. 8 years had passed, but the moment their eyes met, time rewound like a snapped wire recoiling. Cannon didn't blink. Neither did Jasmine. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The past walked into the room with them, invisible but undeniable. Cannon adjusted a folder with surgical precision, her fingers steady, her smile polite, but her gaze carried the smug weight of someone who still believed this room belonged to her. Jasmine leaned into her mic, voice low but resonant. Before we talk about law, let's talk about consequence. One of my clients, Malik Washington, walked into your courtroom with no weapon, no record, and walked out with a 14-year sentence. He didn't threaten anyone, but he looked like someone who could. That's what we're really here to examine, isn't it? Not just precedent, but perception, not just rulings, but patterns. And then it came, fast, surgical, meant to slash through everything that followed. Mr. Chairman, I object to Representative Crockett's opening statement, Cannon said sharply, eyes forward, lips tight. It is speculative, inflammatory, and irrelevant to the inquiry at hand. She didn't glance at Jasmine. She addressed the air above her, like royalty dismissing noise beneath her station. This hearing is about judicial process, not political theater. It wasn't protocol. It was muscle memory. The room didn't shift instantly, but something in its temperature did. Staffers paused mid-scroll. The stenographer's fingers floated, waiting. Even the chairman leaned ever so slightly forward, unsure whether to intervene or witness. But Jasmine didn't recoil. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. She leaned forward just enough to meet her mic, the quiet in her voice louder than any shout. You may not remember me, Your Honor, she said, eyes locked. every syllable controlled like a closing argument before a jury of millions. But I never forgot your ruling. Her words didn't need permission. They didn't ask for acknowledgement. They hung there, not like an accusation, but like a mirror. And in that mirror was a courtroom 8 years ago, a man named Malik Washington, and a judgment that had never been revisited. A ripple passed through the chamber. Not shock, recognition. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning long overdue. One built not on volume, but on memory. One forged not in anger, but in clarity. Behind the public decorum and scripted process, two histories were colliding. One written in unchecked authority, the other carved from everything that authority had erased. But just as the silence began to settle, Judge Cannon reached for the one thing she trusted more than the truth: numbers wrapped in legal polish. She straightened a folder with deliberate calm, then slid a crisp bound report across the table with the precision of someone setting a trap. Her voice returned, not sharp this time, but controlled, dressed in authority, calculated for broadcast. Based on the sentencing integrity report, she began, lifting the document slightly. Once we account for a person's past criminal record, the differences in sentencing mostly disappear. She paused, letting the words linger just long enough for the cameras to catch her confidence and for the message to settle in. The idea that our courts are unfair may sound convincing, but the numbers tell a different story. She didn't look at Jasmine, not directly. She didn't have to. Her tone did the work, polished, detached, and built for defense. Our system isn't perfect, she continued, turning slightly to the committee, but it is fair, and this data proves that. To most listeners, it sounded solid, logical, even neutral. But Jasmine had seen this before, how numbers could be used like armor to hide the wound. The room didn't erupt, but it inhaled. Reporters scribbled, aides leaned in, and a few nods appeared from the conservative flank of the committee. For a brief moment, Cannon looked like she'd regained ground. Numbers are powerful that way, especially when stripped of context and presented in serif font under a federal seal. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't react. Not yet, because she recognized the tactic. Drown lived truth beneath percentages. Sanitize injustice through formulas. And now, with millions watching, she knew exactly what came next. Not defense, but dissection. Quiet, relentless, surgical. But Jasmine didn't come to argue with opinions. She came to bury them with proof. She didn't reach for her papers the way most witnesses did. There was no rustling, no shuffle of nervous hands. Jasmine Crockett opened the folder in front of her like it contained the final pages of a book she'd spent her career reading and rewriting. Her hands moved with purpose, not performance. Her voice was low, unwavering. The tone of someone who knew the truth wasn't on her side. It was in her hands. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission's 2022 report, she began, lifting the document as if it were a ledger of the system's unspoken debts. Black defendants receive prison sentences that are, on average, 19.1% longer than white defendants for the exact same crimes, even when they have no prior record. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight was in the silence that followed, how even the air seemed to hold still, waiting to see who would deny what everyone had just heard. "Let me give you one example," she said, her eyes locking with Cannon's, not in defiance, but in deliberate recollection. Two men, same crime, possession of 50 grams of methamphetamine with intent to distribute. Neither had a criminal record. Both were arrested in the same district, tried in the same year, under the same judge. The pause that followed wasn't dramatic. It was respectful, like a moment of silence for justice unserved. Then she delivered it. The white defendant received 4 years. The judge cited strong family support and potential for rehabilitation. The black defendant received 10. The justification? Need for deterrence and protection of the community. The words didn't just expose a double standard. They revealed a double life. One lived freely, one lived under suspicion, born of nothing but appearance. She let the facts breathe, not to grandstand, but because she understood something Cannon never had to learn. When you've lived inside the margins of power, silence is not absence. It's compression. Jasmine knew this wasn't just a statistical difference. It was a cultural wound with legal paperwork. A courtroom had looked at two men and decided which one was salvageable and which one was dangerous. Same judge, same courtroom, same law, different futures. A tremor ran through the chamber, but no one dared move. The impact wasn't loud. It was heavy. Reporters stopped typing. Committee members looked down, unsure what part of their notes still made sense. Over 12.3 million people were watching. But in that moment, all eyes were on one truth hanging between two women. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply existed in the space her facts had created. A space so honest it couldn't be argued with, only absorbed. It wasn't drama. It was documentation, and it was only beginning to burn. But the more Jasmine pulled back the curtain, the more something shifted behind Cannon's eyes, controlled fury looking for an exit. Judge Cannon had built her entire reputation on control, of the courtroom, of tone, of perception. But now, with the spotlight no longer hers to command, and the facts stacking like quiet indictments, something in her began to fray. Her hands no longer rested calmly atop her binder. One thumb tapped lightly against the edge of the table. Nervous, involuntary. Her gaze, once cool and sweeping, narrowed slightly, as if Jasmine's words had stopped being arguments and started becoming threats. Her breathing remained steady, but her eyes were louder than her breath. She wasn't used to being challenged with receipts, with math, with names. She was used to robes and respect and silence. And now, in front of the cameras, the country, and a woman she once buried with a sentence, she was cornered. The defense she launched next wasn't from the law. It came from the reflexes of privilege. Maybe if your kind stopped blaming the system, you'd learn to succeed within it. The words dropped like a grenade wrapped in civility. The room didn't erupt. It collapsed inward. A stillness washed over the chamber so suddenly, it was as if the oxygen had been sucked out. A young clerk at the end of the gallery knocked over his water bottle, forgot to pick it up. Another aide visibly froze, stylus hovering midair above her tablet. Even the automated camera on the side wall seemed to hesitate, caught mid-pan, as if unsure whether it had just heard what it heard. A sentence like that didn't need to be screamed to be seismic. It was quiet, dismissive, offhand. And that's what made it dangerous. It wasn't rage. It was reflex. And that reflex was loaded. Across the table, Jasmine didn't speak. Not immediately. She didn't look at the committee. She didn't even blink. Her hands stayed folded neatly on the table, but her spine straightened. Not in offense, but in focus. Her expression didn't change, but the silence around her did. It thickened. It waited. She let the weight of the remark sit exactly where it landed. On the record, on camera, under oath. Then she looked up. Not to glare, not to confront, just to meet Cannon's eyes fully, as if to say, "You've finally said out loud what so many have always heard without words." And when she spoke, her voice was steady, low, unhurried, but the room recoiled like it had been hit. "Did you just say, 'you're kind,' on the record?" There was no venom in the question, no accusation, just clarity so sharp it drew blood without ever showing a blade. It wasn't a comeback, it was a corner. And for the first time since the hearing began, Cannon didn't answer. Because sometimes the most damning response is silence. Jasmine let the silence from Cannon's words settle, then pierced it, not with outrage, but with evidence. Her expression didn't change, but her presence grew heavier, more precise. She leaned forward slightly, clicked a small button on the touchpad in front of her, and the overhead lights dimmed as the giant projection screen behind her flickered to life. The hearing chamber, ornate and still, became a courtroom once again, this time with 12 million people watching. Two mugshots appeared side by side, cast in cold government gray tones. On the left, a white young man, 18 years old. On the right, a black teenager, also 18. The contrast wasn't in the charge. It wasn't in the evidence. It was in the sentencing. Jasmine rose slightly in her chair, not to elevate herself, but to make sure the truth she was about to speak had no shadows. "This young man," she said, pointing to the left, was a sophomore at a private university in Virginia. He was arrested in 2016 for possession with intent to distribute. Same charge, first offense. His sentence, probation and counseling. The court cited academic potential and strong family support. She turned slowly to the second face, one just as young, but destined for something far harsher. This young man was a high school senior in Baltimore. Same year, same charge, also a first offense. No history of violence, but his sentence, 10 years in prison. She let the number hang in the air, not as a statistic, but as a life. Why? Because the court said he was a danger to the community and that the sentence was necessary to set an example. No one interrupted her. No one dared. Same crime, same age, same clean record. Different lives. Jasmine paused, then clicked again. A new image appeared on the screen. An email. Plain black background. White text. The kind of email most people scroll past. But this one had a subject line that grabbed the throat. Sentencing talking points. Q1 review. And in bold beneath it, a sentence that made the entire room hold its breath. She didn't explain it right away. She let every person in the chamber read it for themselves. Then her voice dropped into the kind of quiet that demands complete attention. This email was obtained from an internal leak within the Office of Judicial Administrative Policy, she said calmly, her gaze never breaking from the audience. Written by then Chief Advisor Elon Cannon. The air stilled. And then, word for word, she read it aloud, so it could be entered into history. We need to increase sentencing in inner-city robbery cases for deterrence optics. She looked up. Her tone sharpened, not in volume, but in clarity. Not deterrence of crime, deterrence optics. There were no murmurs now, just stillness. The kind that arrives when people realize what they thought was a debate is actually a revelation. Jasmine delivered the final fact like a closing argument. This document was verified last month by the Congressional Ethics Committee. She didn't need to add anything more. The truth had already done its job. It had exposed the unspoken policy of perception over justice, strategy over fairness, where sentences weren't decided just by law, but by image, and where that image, more often than not, was shaped by race, by zip code, by skin. This wasn't just about two young men. It was about the thousands they represented. And in that room, with the lights low and the screen still glowing behind her, Jasmine Crockett wasn't making a case anymore. She was making history, but Jasmine wasn't finished, because some truths aren't just written, they're recorded. She reached under her stack of documents and pulled out a small square speaker. Unassuming, matte black, no label, no theatrics. The room tensed, sensing a shift. She didn't raise her voice or explain. She simply pressed play. A short crackle of static filled the chamber, sharp as a match strike. Then, clear as a gavel falling, came the voice, measured, composed, undeniably real. It was Judge Elon Cannon, not from the bench, not filtered through transcripts. This was her, unguarded, private, and precisely the kind of voice you never expect the public to hear. Minorities don't need leniency, Cannon's voice said flatly. They need discipline. It wasn't screamed. It wasn't snarled. It was stated, like policy, like fact, not with malice, but with conviction. And that made it worse, because what America heard wasn't a moment of anger. It was a philosophy, a belief that had shaped decisions, destroyed futures, and cloaked itself behind court protocol and judicial tone. The room didn't stir. It froze. The temperature dropped a degree as every soul in that chamber processed what had just been laid bare. This wasn't a headline. This wasn't a second-hand quote. This was her, and it was verbatim. One assistant sitting behind the dais clenched his pen so hard it snapped. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Did she just say that?" But the whisper felt like a scream in the stunned silence. Across the room, CNN's broadcast camera adjusted. Slowly, methodically, it zoomed in, tight on Cannon's face. Not the courtroom Cannon, not the composed legal tactician. This was the woman behind the words, now seen by millions. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her complexion, moments earlier warm with control, had faded to an ashen white. Her jaw tightened, but the rest of her seemed motionless, like a statue just beginning to crack. Still, she tried. She adjusted her shoulders, straightened her back, attempted to summon the posture of authority. But the eyes told the truth, and they couldn't outrun what the country had just heard. Because there are things no statement can undo. And once a sentence like that leaves your mouth, on tape, under oath, in your own voice, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to history. And this time, it had a witness with a microphone and the full attention of a nation. And just when it seemed the chamber couldn't hold more, Jasmine leaned in, not to repeat herself, but to widen the scope of the damage. She gave the room just enough time to breathe. Not recover, just breathe. Then she flipped to the next section in her binder, hands as steady as ever. The screen behind her shifted again, revealing the bold heading of a source few in that room could discredit. Brennan Center for Justice, 2023 report on plea bargains and racial disparities. A cluster of clean charts and bullet points appeared on screen, but Jasmine didn't bury the chamber in data. She picked one truth and drove it through the heart of the hearing. The Brennan Center, she said, looking not at her notes but straight at the dais, found that defendants of color consistently receive plea deals that are less favorable than their white counterparts, even when charged with the same crimes, and even when they have the same criminal history. Her voice was clear, but it carried the weight of everything left unspoken by those numbers. No one interrupted. Everyone listened. That means a person who's guilty but white walks out with probation, while a person who's guilty and black pleads to 5 years just to avoid 10. There was no anger in her voice, just gravity. Because this wasn't a political talking point. This was a legal reality, a pattern so common it no longer shocked, only wounded. Jasmine let the silence stretch just long enough for the image to form in the minds of those watching. 2 men, same courtroom, same charge, different futures. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. This isn't about behavior. It's about belief, about who the system thinks is worth a second chance and who it doesn't. Her words weren't aimed at one person. They echoed toward everyone who'd ever dismissed racial disparities as anecdotal. Then, just as the weight of those words settled, Jasmine reached for the remote again. Another slide, another report. This time, the logo of the Pew Research Center appeared, clean and official. Below it, 2022 Judicial Nomination Study, and beneath that, a single line highlighted in yellow. According to Pew, she continued, voice steady but sharpened, nominees of color, Black and Latino especially, are confirmed to federal judgeships at rates 40% lower than white nominees with the exact same qualifications. The room didn't shift, but the energy inside it tightened. Jasmine wasn't just building a case. She was holding up a mirror. So even before someone puts on the robe, the door is already harder to open if you're not white. Not because of merit, but because of perception. Again, her gaze swept the rows of seated members, pausing on no one, addressing everyone. And that's not a theory. That's a pattern. A pattern written not in opinions, but in outcomes. Not whispered in corners, but printed in federal data. And Jasmine, calm, unwavering, composed, had just made sure it could no longer be ignored. By the time Jasmine lowered her binder, the silence wasn't just respect. It was judgment. And this time, it wouldn't wait years to arrive. The gavel didn't slam. It didn't need to. Within 48 hours of the hearing's broadcast, the House Judiciary Committee, an institution not known for speed, called an emergency session behind closed doors. No ceremony, no political theater. Just one agenda item flashing across the chamber screen in block letters. Recommendation for immediate suspension. Judge Elon Cannon. The vote was swift and brutal. 14 in favor, 4 against, no abstentions. Even members who had hesitated privately could no longer deny what the nation had just watched in high definition. Within minutes, the resolution was made public. The committee would formally urge the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts to suspend Cannon from active casework pending full investigation. It was the kind of recommendation usually buried in months of bureaucracy. But this wasn't usual. This was historic. And it was just the beginning. Across the country, the legal world took notice, and it didn't stay silent. That same evening, the American Bar Association, a body known more for nuance than for headlines, released a rare, blistering public statement. No hedging, no qualifiers. Just this. Judge Cannon's conduct warrants immediate review for ethical violations. Those words, short and surgical, cut deeper than any news segment ever could. It wasn't just politicians calling her out now. It was her own profession. The very institution that had once praised her disciplinary consistency was now calling for her to be examined under the lens of the very rules she claimed to uphold. Editorial boards followed fast. Law journals that had once listed her speeches now questioned her case history. The shift wasn't a trickle, it was a landslide. And yet Cannon did what people in power often do when the walls begin to crack. She went to the cameras. At a press podium hastily set up in front of her Florida courthouse, she stood stiff-backed and tight-jawed, refusing to take questions. Her statement was brief but defensive. "This is not about justice," she said flatly. "This is about media distortion and political ambition." No apology, no retraction, just blame. Blame on the press, blame on the committee, blame on the narrative. But the narrative wasn't shaped by the media. It was shaped by her own voice, on tape, on record, under oath. And perhaps the most telling moment came after she stepped away from the podium. No crowd clapped. No colleagues stood beside her. The legal community that once shielded her now watched in silence. The only support she received came from far-right blogs, fringe forums, and a single segment on a cable opinion show that aired after midnight. The talking points were predictable: witch hunt, politicized courts, cancel culture. But the country had already seen the raw footage. The words "your kind" were not opinion. They were reality. And that reality didn't bend to spin. Within a week, the consequences began stacking. Reuters, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, all confirmed through anonymous federal sources that multiple rulings authored by Judge Cannon were now under internal review. Not quietly, not buried in process, but formally flagged for potential bias and misconduct. Dozens of past cases, especially those involving Black and Latino defendants, were pulled for analysis. Defense attorneys began filing motions at record speed, requesting reconsideration of sentences, citing the now public remarks and emails exposed in the hearing. One judge's record, once seen as tough on crime, was now a battlefield of suppressed facts and hidden prejudice. Courtroom by courtroom, transcript by transcript, her history was unraveling. Jasmine didn't appear on every news show. She didn't grandstand, but she didn't disappear either. When asked later why she didn't celebrate, she replied simply, "Because this isn't the finish line. This is just the first time they stopped running away from it." The story had outgrown her, and yet it was her calm, her voice, her refusal to be rattled that triggered the reckoning. Not because she screamed, but because she documented. Because she didn't attack, she presented. She didn't humiliate, she revealed. In one of the most watched moments of the post-hearing news cycle, a retired federal judge, white, Republican, appointed under Reagan, was asked during an MSNBC panel, what made this moment different from all the previous accusations of systemic bias? He didn't hesitate. "We've always had numbers. We've always had stories," he said. But this was the first time America heard both, back to back, from a witness who couldn't be dismissed. He paused and then added, "and from a judge who couldn't hide." In the days that followed, law school classrooms rewrote their ethics syllabi. Civil rights groups launched rapid response task forces to help families affected by Cannon's rulings seek retrials. One prominent conservative magazine, once an open admirer of Cannon's sentencing record, quietly removed 3 of her op-eds from its archives. A legal culture that had long whispered about disparities was now, finally, naming them. And still, Cannon remained silent. Not legally, not officially. She issued statements. But they were hollow, cold, punctuated by the kind of phrases that work in doctrine but fail in human consequence. In private, sources from within the 11th Circuit admitted she no longer took part in internal deliberations. She arrived late. She left early. She spoke only when addressed. Her chambers, once among the most active in Florida, slowed to a crawl. She was still a judge, but she was no longer trusted to judge. And while she remained technically on the bench, every ruling she touched became a question mark. Her name, once wielded with authority in legal circles, now trailed an asterisk of doubt. And for the first time in her career, Judge Aileen Cannon was no longer the one handing out consequences. She was standing in the middle of them. And after the reports, the emails, and the tape, Jasmine did one last thing. She reminded them what all those numbers actually meant. She closed her binder with both hands, slow and intentional. It wasn't a mic drop. It was a release. A gesture that said, "You've seen the data, now see the people." Her eyes scanned the chamber, not to challenge anyone, but to see if anyone was still listening with their conscience, not just their title. Then she leaned forward just enough for the microphone to catch the gravity in her voice, and she began, not with accusations, but with something far more disarming: stories, real names, real lives. "Let me tell you about a man named Luis," she said calmly, deliberately, each syllable measured like a closing argument. "Luis is a warehouse supervisor in Houston. He's worked there for 3 years without missing a paycheck. He rents a 2-bedroom apartment and pays on time. He has no debt, no record, and no history of violence or abandonment. He applied to sponsor his 15-year-old son's immigration petition so they could be together again. They'd been separated for 4 years after his wife died. He submitted everything: W-2s, tax returns, a letter from his employer." Jasmine took a moment. Her voice didn't waver, but the stillness in the room sharpened. You could hear the sound of someone setting down a pen 3 rows back. "And the court denied him. The official reason, they said he lacked financial stability." She let the absurdity breathe, then delivered the truth like a scalpel. "He didn't fail the process. The process failed him. Because when your name is Luis and your zip code starts with 770, stability looks different in their eyes." No one interrupted. No one scribbled. The silence in the chamber was no longer neutral. It was holding its breath. Jasmine inhaled once, slowly, and moved on. "And then there's Camille," she said. "She's a single mother of 2 in Philadelphia. Her youngest had asthma. Her oldest was out of diapers, but still too small for school lunches to be enough. Camille worked 3 jobs: fast food, cleaning houses, and overnight stocking. But rent jumped, and in February, during a snowstorm, she was arrested for shoplifting. Soup cans, formula, a toothbrush, a $4 pair of socks for her daughter. The screen behind her stayed dark. No photos, no evidence, just truth. She pled guilty to avoid jail time, got a misdemeanor, probation, community service. She did everything right after that, didn't miss a day, attended the parenting classes, paid every fine. A pause. But when she went to family court to regain custody of her children, the judge ruled she had demonstrated poor judgment and a pattern of instability. They said she posed a risk of recidivism. Jasmine's voice stayed even, but the weight in the room shifted again. There was no visible outrage, but there was stillness, the kind of stillness that only comes when people feel something they can't argue with. Camille didn't lose her kids because she stole. She lost them because she couldn't afford not to. For a moment, Jasmine let that story settle. She didn't rush to the next point. She let Camille breathe in the chamber, let her presence be felt even if her voice had never been heard here. And then Jasmine spoke again, but this time, not on behalf of others. "My own story isn't special." Her voice was softer now, not weaker, quieter, like someone telling the truth that doesn't need drama to sting. 5 years ago, I filed a motion to appeal a case I was handling. There were factual errors in the record, spelling mistakes in key affidavits, documents that were logged out of order, timestamps that didn't match testimony. Even opposing counsel didn't dispute all of it. Her hands didn't move. Her posture didn't change. But the intensity behind her words began to crystallize. But the appeal was denied, not because the court said the errors weren't real, but because they claimed I hadn't proven those errors would have made a difference. A slow inhale. The court said I failed to demonstrate sufficient likelihood of error. She didn't blink. I didn't ask for a new trial. I didn't ask for a miracle. I asked for review. And the door still closed. No one in the room said a word, because they didn't need to. Jasmine's voice had dropped every defense they could have reached for. These weren't hypotheticals. These weren't theories. These were human beings with stories that mirrored far too many others. And then she ended it, not with a question, not with blame, but with the one sentence that no one in the room could refute. It's not about your intent, it's about your impact. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because with those 9 words, she didn't accuse Judge Cannon. She indicted a system. And this time, it had no closing argument strong enough to cover the silence that followed. And when the last of Jasmine's words faded, the room didn't move, but Washington did. Within 24 hours, the House Judiciary Committee reconvened in an emergency closed-door session. No press, no ceremony, just a room full of lawmakers, many of whom had tried, until now, to keep their heads low, forced to reckon with what had just unfolded before the nation. There were no fiery speeches this time, no partisan sniping, just a simple resolution typed in 14-point font and passed across the table. The committee formally recommends articles of impeachment against federal judge Elon M. Cannon on the grounds of demonstrated bias, ethical misconduct, and abuse of judicial authority. The vote wasn't unanimous. It didn't need to be. It was swift. 13 votes for, 5 against, 2 abstaining, faces white with discomfort, their pens never touching paper. No one clapped, no one cheered, but history had moved, and it had moved hard. Within hours of the committee's recommendation, the Department of Justice broke its silence. Attorney General's office issued a rare, high-level statement announcing the launch of a formal investigation into systemic judicial bias under Cannon's tenure. Not just an ethics review, a full-scale inquiry. Subpoenas were prepared, clerks and former staffers were contacted, and most notably, DOJ announced it would re-examine case patterns over a 10-year span, specifically looking at racial disparities in sentencing, plea deal approval, bail assignments, and pretrial detention outcomes. It was the kind of announcement that usually comes buried beneath weeks of red tape. This time it came in under 6 hours. Federal investigators began cross-referencing rulings, combing through internal emails, and requesting sealed memos from prior trials that had long escaped scrutiny. One anonymous source inside the DOJ told Politico, "We've never seen this level of uniformity in the patterns before, not without someone deliberately engineering it." Suddenly, cases that had been considered closed were no longer safe. Files from 2015, 2017, 2021, all reopened. Cannon's own internal sentencing memos were now admissible material. The DOJ brought in independent analysts to audit the language of her rulings, word frequency comparisons, emotional tone analyses, and keyword flags. The words discipline, deterrence, and community threat appeared disproportionately, especially in rulings against defendants of color. And then came the bombshell. Investigators uncovered a previously unreleased 2019 internal review written by Cannon herself, recommending that judges in her district maintain harsher sentencing standards to preserve the appearance of authority in urban-centered dockets. It wasn't policy, it wasn't law, but it was enough to signal intent. And in an impeachment proceeding, intent is everything. The media erupted. The New York Times called it the most public reckoning of judicial partiality in a generation. CNN ran a 2-hour special report simply titled, "Who Gets Justice?" Meanwhile, court reform advocates flooded the airwaves, pointing out that it had taken years of complaints, lawsuits, ignored letters, and buried whistleblowers for this day to arrive. But one woman, one hearing, one voice, with facts, not fire, had cracked it open. Cannon tried to fight back. She filed a statement of rebuttal with the Judicial Conference, calling the investigation deeply politicized and accusing the House Committee of weaponizing isolated language. But the evidence wasn't isolated anymore. It was aggregated, layered, cumulative. And worse, it was televised. America hadn't just read about the bias. They'd heard it, seen it, and watched someone finally stand still in its face and speak truth without blinking. The pressure wasn't just legal, It was personal. Former clerks who had once quietly transferred out of her office now stepped forward, anonymously or through attorneys. One described a culture of presumption, not proof. Another said, she didn't break the law. She bent it, consistently, always in the same direction. Her chambers, once among the most feared and respected in the district, had become radioactive. Junior judges distanced themselves. Former allies declined comment. And Cannon, though technically still on the bench, was quietly removed from all active cases while under investigation. Every trial she touched in the past 10 years now carried an asterisk. And as for Jasmine Crockett, she didn't speak to the press. She didn't do the late-night talk shows. She posted a single sentence on her official account. This was never about a person. This was about a pattern. That sentence trended for days. In law schools across the country, ethics professors rewrote lectures. In federal buildings, staffers redrew lines between hard justice and biased power. And in communities long ignored by the judicial system, something unfamiliar stirred. Not celebration, but recognition. A kind of hope that doesn't yell. It hums, low, steady, and real. Because this time, the system was finally forced to put itself on trial. And this time, it didn't get to write the verdict in advance. And while the investigation gathered momentum behind closed doors, the consequences outside moved just as swiftly and far more visibly. It started quietly. No press releases, no op-eds. Just a series of polite, sudden withdrawals. One by one, the nation's top law schools began sending out carefully worded emails. Schedule conflicts, revised programming, unforeseen institutional priorities. But behind the professional phrasing was something far more deliberate. They were pulling the plug. Institutions that had once proudly invited Judge Elon Cannon to guest lecture on judicial consistency and constitutional restraint were now walking her name back in silence. Harvard rescinded her spring invitation. Georgetown followed, then Stanford. Within days, a memo circulated internally at New York University Law. Any prior association with Judge Cannon should not be referenced in current promotional material. Her name, once presented as a badge of legal credibility, had become a liability. Faculty members who had once championed her disciplinary clarity began to fall conspicuously quiet. Some issued soft apologies. Others avoided the topic altogether. Students at Yale Law School organized a panel titled, "When the Bench Fails the People." Cannon's photo was the cover slide. The message was clear. This wasn't about tradition anymore. This was about accountability. No more lectures, no more panels, no more pretending that objectivity could be weaponized and still be called justice. Meanwhile, the media, famously obsessed with courtroom drama, made a different choice. They didn't rerun the hearing in full. They didn't loop the audio of her words or the moment Jasmine said, "Did you just say, 'you're kind', on the record?" That moment had already played enough. Instead, what aired across 3 major networks that Friday night was something far simpler and far more damning. It was a 14-second clip. No voiceover, no commentary, just footage of Judge Elon Cannon leaving the federal courthouse in Miami through the rear loading dock exit. The sunlight had already faded. The loading zone lights flickered yellow, casting long shadows on the concrete. She wasn't flanked by staff. There were no cameras in her face, no reporters shouting questions. Just a single marshal walking 3 paces behind her, and the dull slam of a security door closing. She didn't turn around. She didn't speak. She clutched a stack of case files against her chest like a shield and disappeared into a waiting black SUV with government plates and no emblem. No one opened the door for her. That image, more than anything she'd said in her own defense, was what America remembered. A judge once seen as immovable, reduced not by scandalous spectacle, but by the silent erosion of credibility. And it didn't take a narrator to explain what that meant. The door had closed behind her, but the country had already seen enough. The networks played it once, then again. Then it became background footage in news segments, not about her, but about institutional bias, about overdue reform, about the myth of impartiality. The clip spread, not as a meme, not as mockery, but as a symbol. Even late-night hosts didn't joke. They paused. Let it play. Let the image say what words no longer needed to. And somewhere in every corner of the legal world, a quiet reckoning rippled outward, not from gavel to gavel, but from screen to screen. Because that walk through the service exit wasn't just about one judge falling. It was about a system that, for the first time in far too long, was finally starting to look itself in the mirror. And after the hearings, the headlines, and the thunder of consequences, came the one moment that mattered most. Not inside the courthouse, but just outside its doors. The doors opened, heavy and deliberate, groaning on their hinges like they too had carried the weight of what had happened inside. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk through them as a hero. She didn't emerge as a victor. She stepped out like someone carrying something no one else could see, something too heavy to celebrate. Her heels struck the stone steps with sharp precision, but she moved slowly, carefully, as if every step she took was still tethered to the 1,000 voices she had just spoken for. No security detail cleared her path. No aides flanked her on either side. She walked alone. The sunlight outside had shifted since the hearing began. Now it hung low, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps and giving the columns behind her a golden haze, like the end of a day that had taken years to arrive. Down below, behind waist-high barricades, a sea of people waited. No one chanted. No one clapped. The usual roar of political spectacle was absent. Instead, there was something harder to explain, something colder. Silence, dense and unbroken, as if even breath felt too loud for this moment. She passed the press line. Cameras clicked mechanically, but no reporter dared shout her name. Microphones were lifted, but left unanswered. The restraint wasn't courtesy. It was reverence. Jasmine's eyes didn't flinch, didn't sweep the crowd for validation. She looked straight ahead, past the microphones, past the reporters, past the lenses searching for a soundbite. Her silence was the soundbite. And then she reached the edge of the steps and saw them. Lining the sidewalk were people who had come not for politics, but for proof that the system could still respond to truth. Parents holding the hands of their children, elderly men in union jackets, teachers still in school lanyards, young people with notebooks clutched like shields. They weren't loud. They were present. And in their presence, they said more than any slogan could. They held signs, not the kind with logos or hashtags, but homemade, handwritten, worn by weather and waiting. One read, "Truth doesn't tremble." Another, "Justice is not neutral." But the sign that stood tallest, held in both hands by a man with tearful eyes and a trembling jaw, said it all. "Your kind? We built this court." Jasmine saw it. She didn't react. But something behind her gaze shifted, like a wall giving way to memory. Then from the side of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. Not loud, not frantic. A girl, young, 14, maybe 15, dark brown skin, hair tied in a tight ponytail. She wore a school backpack and gripped a blue spiral notebook to her chest with both arms. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't wave. She simply asked. "Excuse me," the girl said softly. The silence around her parted like water. Jasmine stopped. Their eyes met. "Do you think—" The girl's voice quivered, but never broke. "Do you think I could become a lawyer, even if I've never met one?" For the first time all day, Jasmine's shoulders dropped, not in defeat, in recognition, in the weight of everything she had just carried suddenly becoming visible in the face of someone she didn't know, but already understood. There was no filter on the girl's question, no performance, just honesty, just hope, hanging naked in the air between them. Jasmine stepped forward, not rushed, not theatrical. She crouched down, knees to the pavement, so their eyes were level. So the building behind her no longer towered over the girl, but stood behind her, like a promise instead of a wall. Jasmine didn't look at the cameras. She didn't scan for who was watching. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was the girl and the space between her question and the answer. Then, with a calm that could quiet hurricanes, Jasmine spoke. "You don't need to know one." She smiled, not wide but warm, full, unshakable. "You just need to be one?" The girl didn't speak. Her eyes did. They filled, not with tears but with certainty, with something harder than belief, understanding. The kind that comes not when someone tells you you're possible, but when they show you. Jasmine reached out and gently touched the girl's notebook, pressing 2 fingers against it. No speech, no directions, just connection. And in that moment, the crowd didn't cheer. They exhaled, as if they'd all been holding their breath, waiting to see what justice actually looked like. Not in legal doctrine, not in articles, but right there, in the face of a girl who had never seen a lawyer that looked like her, being told that she didn't need to find a door that would open for her. She was the door. The cameras caught none of the dialogue, but they captured the posture, the gaze, the symmetry of that image. One woman rising from a system she'd confronted. One girl rising into the system she was about to enter. Later that evening, the moment would go viral. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. No lights, no quotes. Just the stillness of 2 people. One giving back everything she never received. The other finally seeing a path that didn't require permission to walk. And for the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel abstract. It didn't feel cold or procedural. It felt like eye contact. And it spoke like truth. And after the hearings, the headlines and the thunder of consequences, came the one moment that mattered most. Not inside the courthouse, but just outside its doors. The lesson didn't arrive with a gavel. It didn't come printed on an ethics report or written into a resolution passed by a committee. It arrived in the quiet, in the space between outrage and reflection, in the way people looked at each other after Jasmine spoke, not as opponents, not as partisans, but as witnesses. Witnesses to a truth that had always existed, but had rarely been acknowledged with such precision, such restraint, such force. Because what Jasmine offered wasn't just a testimony, it was a mirror. And what that mirror showed was the quiet machinery of exclusion. Dignified, procedural, and devastatingly consistent. Justice isn't just what happens in a courtroom. It's what happens before the first word is spoken. It's the invisible calculus that decides who gets the benefit of the doubt and who gets the maximum sentence. It's the difference between being seen as redeemable and being labeled a warning. That was the lesson. Jasmine didn't say it directly. She didn't have to. It lived in every example she gave, every number she recited, every story she let hang in the air long enough to hurt. She knew that people don't fear the truth. They fear what it demands of them once it's spoken. For years, the system had relied on silence, not just from victims, but from those inside it who knew better and chose convenience over conscience. Jasmine had walked into that hearing as someone the system had once tried to silence. She walked out as someone who had made silence impossible. That's the power of truth when it's delivered without apology, when it doesn't need to shout because it's carried by something heavier than anger. Clarity. And clarity doesn't just change minds, it changes atmospheres. But the deeper lesson, the one that settled like smoke long after the cameras stopped rolling, was this. You cannot correct what you refuse to see, and you cannot see what you've taught yourself to rationalize. Jasmine didn't ask the system to feel. She asked it to look at its patterns, its outcomes, its excuses dressed as objectivity. She didn't demand remorse, she demanded recognition. And the difference mattered, because recognition makes silence harder to maintain. And that's where change begins, not with policy, but with discomfort. The lesson lived in how Cannon looked away, in how the court staff froze when the recording played, in how no one rushed to defend her afterward. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew what they had heard wasn't an outburst, it was a worldview, sanitized, systematized, weaponized through routine. Jasmine cracked it open, not with drama, but with fact. She didn't beg to be heard. She made not hearing her no longer an option. Justice in that moment was no longer a legal principle. It was a lived condition. It was Camille losing her children for shoplifting dinner. It was Luis being told 3 years of employment still made him unstable. It was a young black woman being denied a rightful appeal because clerical error didn't prove harm. And that was the most haunting truth Jasmine delivered. Not that the system had failed, but that it had succeeded exactly as it was designed. The moral wasn't tucked inside legal nuance. It was scrawled across the record like a bruise that kept being pressed. And what Jasmine asked was simple. What if we finally stop pretending this isn't intentional? That question, unspoken but undeniable, is what stuck in the bones of everyone who watched. Not just lawmakers, not just lawyers, everyone. Bus drivers, students, clerks, viewers who had never stepped foot in a courtroom but knew injustice by instinct. They didn't need to be taught what bias looked like. They just needed someone brave enough to name it in a room that had never been forced to listen. And still, Jasmine asked for no applause, no vengeance, no reversal of fortune. Her point wasn't to take power, it was to reveal what happens when power is never questioned, when wearing a robe becomes a shield from accountability, when the language of law is used to excuse the absence of fairness. What she exposed wasn't illegal. That's what made it terrifying. It was legal, routine, defensible, and deadly. Because power, left unchallenged, doesn't need to shout. It whispers into rulings. It echoes in bail amounts. It hides in footnotes. Jasmine showed America what that power sounds like when you strip away the polish and replay its own voice, word for word, gavel by gavel. And in doing so, she taught something else too, that calm isn't weakness, and that fury, when aimed precisely, becomes truth. But the real human lesson came not from the committee's vote or the DOJ's announcement. It came from that young girl's question, that moment when a child asked whether she was allowed to dream in a world that had taught her to stay quiet. Jasmine didn't just say yes. She showed her that the system may close doors, but it can't unteach courage. That knowing someone isn't a requirement for becoming them, and that history doesn't wait for permission. It waits for someone to speak without flinching. And so the courtroom quieted, the headlines rotated, and the next story began. But what lingered in every hallway, every chamber, every classroom and bench and community center where the hearing was replayed on cracked phones and aging projectors was the echo of a single idea. It's not about your intent, it's about your impact. And if you forget that, the system forgets us all. But Jasmine Crockett didn't step into that courtroom just to be heard. She stepped in to remind America that justice isn't self-correcting. It requires confrontation, it requires action, and that responsibility now falls to us. This is not where the story ends. It never was. Jasmine's testimony wasn't a conclusion, it was a beginning. And beginnings are never gentle. They demand discomfort. They demand that we stop applauding bravery from the sidelines and start wielding it in our daily lives. Because what she exposed wasn't just the failure of one judge. It was the quiet, polite machinery of institutional neglect. And now that we've seen the gears turn, how bias is processed, stamped, and passed off as law, there is no excuse for looking away. America heard the facts, the numbers, the stories, the voices that had long been silenced by sealed records and procedural deflections. Jasmine didn't scream. She didn't grandstand. She presented, with clarity, with proof, with memory. And in doing so, she left no room for plausible deniability. What followed wasn't just fallout, it was evidence that one voice, in one room, backed by truth and conviction, can make the most fortified walls start to sweat. But change doesn't hold unless we hold it there. It slips the moment we step back. That's the trap, thinking that revelation is revolution. It isn't. Revelation is just the opening scene. Revolution is what we do after. The time for observation has passed. We are all on record now, whether we chose to speak or stayed silent. The system is counting on our fatigue, our distraction, our tendency to click away. But if you heard Jasmine's words, if you felt the weight behind, it's not about your intent, it's about your impact, then you no longer have the luxury of neutrality. Because neutrality in the face of systemic injustice is not peacekeeping. It's permission. It's a vote cast in favor of the way things have always been, at the expense of what they must become. So what now? Now you act, in whatever space you occupy. You act not out of guilt, but out of clarity. Out of the understanding that justice doesn't trickle from the Supreme Court down. It rises from classrooms, from courtrooms, from conversations where people finally stop editing their truth to keep others comfortable. It rises when you challenge a sentencing policy that's buried under bureaucratic jargon, when you vote in local elections that appoint judges with unchecked power, When you ask why black teenagers are labeled threats, while white ones are called troubled. And when you refuse to accept that silence equals civility. You act by learning the names of the judges on your ballot, not just the celebrities on the bench. You look up their records. You attend school board meetings where disciplinary policies are often early blueprints for courtroom disparities. You listen, especially to the stories that don't end with perfect victims or clear heroes, because real justice lives in the gray, and that's where the work begins. And if the work feels slow, that's because it is. Real change doesn't come with hashtags or headlines alone. It comes when uncomfortable truths are no longer considered radical, but required reading. It comes when we stop waiting for perfect messengers and start honoring imperfect ones who still dare to speak. You don't need to hold a microphone in Congress to demand accountability. You can start by asking better questions at dinner tables, town halls, and jury pools. You can start by no longer letting polite silence swallow ugly realities. Because the system banks on your exhaustion. It thrives when you believe your voice is too small to matter. It wins when you scroll past a statistic because you think someone else will care for you. But here's the truth. Power only listens to pain when that pain is organized, when it refuses to dress itself up in respectability just to be heard, when it stops asking for permission. So maybe you're not a lawyer. Maybe you've never stepped foot inside a courtroom. That doesn't mean this isn't your fight, because injustice is a ripple, and it eventually touches everything. It's in the school where a child is suspended for attitude instead of being asked what happened. It's in the job application tossed out because of a name that sounds unfamiliar. It's in the headline that says, "Unarmed black man shot," and the follow-up that says, "No charges filed." So don't wait for the next viral moment to feel something. Let this moment move you to do something. Volunteer at a bail fund. Join a jury and speak truth into that room. Organize a voter registration drive, not just in swing states, but in overlooked zip codes where silence has been weaponized. Ask your city council who sets police discipline guidelines. Ask your school board how many suspensions last year involved students of color. Ask your heart why it took a courtroom breakdown on live television to believe what your neighbors have been saying for decades. Because what Jasmine Crockett did in that hearing wasn't magic. It wasn't even new. It was memory made visible. It was pain made plain. And it was truth that finally refused to be polite. You don't need a platform like hers to do the same. You just need a spine, a voice, and the refusal to keep pretending that justice is inevitable. It isn't. It's built, brick by painful brick, by people who show up after the cameras turn off. So show up. And when you do, bring others with you. Because the fight doesn't end when the gavel drops. It begins when someone like you refuses to leave the courtroom in silence. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.